Have you ever stopped for a moment and wondered whether everything around you is actually real? Not just your thoughts, not just your memories, but the entire world itself. The room you are sitting in, the sky above you, the stars, the laws of physics, even the person reading these words right now. What if all of it is only an extremely advanced simulation, not a dream, not a metaphor? A full, structured, information-based reality so convincing that the beings living inside it would never know the difference. This idea sounds like science fiction, something from a movie, something designed to make people feel uneasy for a few minutes and then forget about it. But the strange part is that the simulation hypothesis is not just a fantasy. It has been taken seriously by philosophers, scientists, and futurists. And one of the most influential modern arguments for it came from a philosopher named Nick Bostrom. Bostrom is the mind behind one of the most famous versions of this idea. And once you understand the logic behind it, the question becomes much harder to dismiss. Because the simulation hypothesis is not really asking, could computers create fake worlds someday? It is asking something much deeper. It is asking whether we are already inside one. To understand this idea properly, we need to start with the simplest version. A simulation is any constructed reality created by some higher intelligence. That intelligence could be human, or artificial, or something else entirely. In theory, if a civilization becomes advanced enough, it might be able to create entire worlds populated by conscious beings. Those beings would live, think, love, suffer, and die inside the simulation without ever realizing their universe was built. From the inside, the simulation would feel completely real. And that is the key point. A world does not have to be physical in the way we normally imagine physical things in order to be experienced as real by the beings inside it. If your entire reality is built on rules, patterns, and information, then from your perspective, that reality is simply reality. You would not see the code. You would only see the world the code produces. And that leads to the first terrifying thought. If our universe is a simulation, then the difference between real and simulated may not matter to the people inside it nearly as much as we think. Because pain still hurts. Joy still feels joyful, time still passes, choices still matter to the beings who make them. So the real question is not only whether the universe is simulated, the real question is whether we could ever know. Now let's bring in the man most closely associated with the modern simulation argument, Nick Bostrom. Bostrom is a philosopher from Oxford who laid out a famous argument in the early 2000s. His idea was not that we have proof we live in a simulation. It was something more subtle. He argued that at least one of three possibilities must be true. The first possibility is that advanced civilizations almost always go extinct before they become capable of creating realistic simulated universes. The second is that civilizations that become advanced enough simply lose interest in creating such simulations. And the third possibility is that advanced civilizations do create huge numbers of ancestor simulations. And if they do, then statistically, we are probably inside one of them. That is the core logic. It is not proof. It is a probability argument. And that is what makes it so unsettling, because it does not begin by claiming something impossible. It begins by asking what a future civilization might do if it reaches a level of technology far beyond our own. If a civilization can simulate conscious minds, and if it can do so in enormous numbers, then the number of simulated beings could far exceed the number of original biological beings. At that point, most conscious observers would not be in the base reality. They would be inside simulations. And if that is true, then the odds may not be on our side. So let's slow down and examine the three possibilities more carefully. The first possibility is extinction. Maybe civilizations simply do not survive long enough to reach that stage. They might destroy themselves through war, climate collapse, biological disaster, runaway technology, or some other failure we have not yet imagined. If that is true, then no advanced civilization gets far enough to build realistic ancestor simulations. In that case, we are not in a simulation, because no one is ever able to make one. The second possibility is that advanced civilizations exist, but they choose not to run simulations of conscious beings. Maybe they consider it unethical. Maybe they think it is pointless. Maybe they develop interests so different from ours that ancestor simulations simply do not appeal to them. Maybe they are so evolved that they stop caring about recreating their own history. If that is true, then again, we probably are not in a simulation. But the third possibility is the most disturbing one. Advanced civilizations survive. They become capable of creating vast numbers of detailed simulations, and they choose to do it. If that happens, then simulated minds could outnumber original minds by a massive margin. And if that is the case, then any randomly selected conscious being is much more likely to be simulated than original. That is the heart of the argument. Not that simulation is guaranteed, but that if it becomes technologically possible and is widely practiced, then we could easily be inside one without knowing it. At this point, people usually ask the same question. Okay, but what would a simulated universe actually look like? Would there be glitches? Would the sky flicker? Would objects disappear when no one is looking? Would we find some obvious bug in the system? Maybe, but probably not. If the simulation were advanced enough, it would not need to behave like a cheap computer game with visible seams. It would need to be perfect enough to sustain conscious life. That means the rules would have to be stable, coherent, and internally consistent. From the inside, it would have to feel like a natural universe. Otherwise, the beings inside it might notice. And if the creators are intelligent, they would likely avoid that. So if there are clues, they might not look like broken graphics or obvious glitches. They might appear as strange features of physics. For example, some people point to the fact that the universe seems to have limits. There is a smallest meaningful scale, like the Planck length. There are maximum speeds, like the speed of light. There are quantized values in nature. There are seemingly abstract mathematical structures underlying physical laws. To some people, that can feel a little bit like a system built on rules, like a game engine with constraints. But that is only an analogy, not evidence. It is possible that reality is simply mathematical at its core. It is also possible that our physics is incomplete and these limits are just part of a deeper natural structure. So none of that proves simulation. Still, the feeling remains. The universe does not always behave like messy matter floating randomly in empty space. It often behaves like something organized, something encoded, something that can be described. This is where the simulation hypothesis gets philosophically dangerous. Because once you start thinking about reality as information, the boundary between physical and abstract begins to blur. Consider this. A computer simulation can generate a world that exists only as data. But if the data is processed in a consistent way, then characters inside that world would have experiences, histories, and identities. They would not know they are made of code. They would think the world is simply the world. Now imagine that our own universe is built on something similar. Maybe not a literal modern computer, maybe something much stranger, but a system that produces a stable reality through rules and information. Then the idea of base matter becomes less important than the rules that define the world. And once that happens, the old distinction between real and simulated starts to feel less solid. The simulated world is still a world. The simulated consciousness is still consciousness. The simulated pain is still pain. So perhaps the real issue is not whether the universe is fake. Perhaps the real issue is whether fake even means what we think it means. Now let's talk about consciousness, because this is where the entire argument becomes much harder. It is one thing to simulate weather, planets, or galaxies. It is another thing entirely to simulate a mind. Could a machine really create a conscious being? Could a computer process lead to genuine awareness? Or would it only create a perfect imitation of awareness? This is one of the deepest unsolved questions in philosophy and science. We do not fully understand how consciousness arises even in biological brains. We know a lot about neurons, signals, and brain regions, but we do not have a complete explanation for why subjective experience exists at all. Why is there something it feels like to be you? Why is awareness accompanied by an inner point of view? That mystery matters because the simulation hypothesis depends on whether consciousness can be substrate independent. In plain language, that means whether consciousness can exist in more than one kind of material system. If consciousness requires biological brains, then simulating a mind may not create a real conscious being. It may only create a non-conscious imitation. But if consciousness emerges from computation or information processing, then a sufficiently advanced simulation could absolutely contain real minds. And if that is true, then the simulated beings inside it would be fully real in the only way that matters to them. This is why some philosophers treat the simulation hypothesis not as science fiction, but as a serious problem in metaphysics, because it forces us to ask what reality actually is. Is reality made of matter? Is it made of information? Is it made of observation? Is it made of something deeper that our current language cannot capture? And once you ask those questions, the simulation hypothesis becomes a doorway into a much larger mystery. Even if the universe is not a simulation, thinking about it this way can reveal something important. It shows how limited our intuitions are. We assume our perspective is central. We assume the universe is built the way we imagine it. We assume reality must be solid, physical, and straightforward. But those assumptions may just be the habits of evolved brains trying to survive in a small corner of the cosmos. They may tell us very little about the universe at large. Another reason this idea is so compelling is that it connects to other deep questions in cosmology. For example, why do the laws of physics seem so precisely tuned for complexity? Why does the universe have constants that appear almost strangely convenient for the emergence of stars, chemistry, and life? Some people interpret this as evidence of design. Others see it as evidence that there are many universes and we happen to be in one that allows observers. And some people see it as something else entirely, a sign that reality may have been intentionally constructed, not necessarily by a god in the traditional sense, but by an intelligence that set the rules and let the system unfold. That does not prove simulation either, but it makes the question feel less absurd than it first appears. Because once you begin to accept that a universe can be described by laws, constants, and structures, it becomes easier to imagine those laws being implemented by some deeper mechanism. And if that mechanism were artificial, then the universe would be a simulation. Of course, the biggest problem with all of this is evidence. Right now, we do not have direct proof that we live in a simulation. We do not have a crack in reality we can point to and say, "There, that is the code." We do not have a message from the outside. We do not have a test that definitively separates base reality from a sufficiently advanced simulation. That is part of what makes the idea so slippery. A perfect simulation may be indistinguishable from reality from the inside. If the laws are consistent, then every experiment you perform will still obey those laws. Any evidence you gather would just be part of the simulated world. So even if we are inside one, the simulation may be designed so that discovery is impossible. That creates a strange situation. The hypothesis is logically possible. It is philosophically serious. It is emotionally disturbing, and yet it may be scientifically unreachable. Still, that has not stopped people from proposing possible clues. Some have suggested that the universe could show signs of digital structure at the smallest scales. Some speculate that if reality is computed, it might have finite resolution. Others think anomalies in quantum mechanics might hint at deeper information processing. The observer effect in quantum physics is often dragged into this discussion. People see it and say, "Look, reality behaves differently when measured." That sounds like rendering. But we need to be careful here. Quantum mechanics is weird, yes, deeply weird, but weird does not mean simulated. The observer effect does not automatically imply consciousness creates reality in the way people sometimes imagine. It simply means measurement plays a fundamental role in how quantum systems behave in our current theories. That is fascinating, but it is not proof of a computer-generated universe. Likewise, the fact that the universe can be described mathematically does not mean it is software. It might just mean that mathematics is the language of physical reality, or it might mean something even stranger. The point is that none of these clues are decisive. They are invitations to think, not conclusions. One of the most interesting parts of the simulation hypothesis is that it reveals something about human nature. We are pattern-seeking beings. We are always trying to understand the world by building models of it. That is what science is. That is what philosophy is. That is what imagination is. So when we encounter something as vast and mysterious as existence itself, it is natural that we would ask whether there is a hidden structure behind it, a hidden intelligence, a hidden design, a hidden system. Maybe that instinct is just our own minds projecting order onto chaos. Or maybe it is the first sign that reality really is layered in ways we do not yet understand. There is also a darker emotional reason this idea sticks, because it changes the feeling of being alive. If this world is real, then our lives are part of something enormous, but still fundamentally rooted in nature. If this world is simulated, then everything becomes uncertain. Our history, our death, our origin, even the meaning of our suffering could be different from what we think. And yet, oddly enough, the emotional consequence is not always despair. For some people, it creates a strange kind of liberation. If reality is constructed, then maybe reality is more flexible than we think. Maybe existence is not as fixed as it appears. Maybe there are layers beyond this one. Maybe consciousness can survive in forms we have not imagined. That is why the simulation hypothesis is not just creepy. It is also seductive. It turns the universe into a mystery again. It makes reality feel unfinished. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a question that is both simple and impossible. Are we real? Or are we living inside something that only looks real from the inside? Nick Bostrom's argument does not force us to accept that we are simulated. But it does force us to take the possibility seriously. And once you do that, it becomes hard to look at the world in exactly the same way again. Because now every object, every memory, every star overhead can feel a little different. Not less meaningful, just less certain. And that uncertainty is what makes the idea so powerful. Maybe the universe is base reality. Maybe it is a simulation. Maybe the truth is something even stranger than either of those. But for now, from where we stand, we can only observe the world through the narrow window of our own experience. We cannot step outside easily. We cannot inspect the machine directly. We cannot ask the creators, if there are any, to reveal themselves. All we can do is think. And perhaps that is enough to make the question worth asking. Because in the end, the simulation hypothesis is not only about computers, worlds, or future civilizations. It is about the deepest human fear of all, the fear that reality is not what it seems. And maybe, just maybe, that fear exists because on some level, we sense how little we really know. If this is a simulation, then someone somewhere wrote the rules. If this is not a simulation, then reality itself is even stranger than we imagined. Either way, the universe remains a mystery. And maybe that is the most honest answer we have. We are here, we are aware, we are asking questions, and for now that is all we can truly prove. But the next time you look up at the night sky, remember this. Every star you see could be part of something far beyond your understanding. A natural cosmos, a mathematical structure, a cosmic machine, or a program so vast that its inhabitants can only call it reality. And if that is true, then the most terrifying thing is not that the universe is fake. It is that, from inside it, the fake and the real might be exactly the same.